It's been a while since I've done one of these, but I thought it would be a good time to take some time and talk about the history of LUMIX, specifically the GH cameras. I find those to be the most interesting Micro Four Thirds cameras. I've been shooting with them since all the way back on the GH1. And looking back on it, it's been quite a long time. And there's probably a lot of people out there who don't quite understand why a GH6 or a GH7 would be special if you don't understand that history. So this is December of 2024. Obviously things could change in the future, but at the current point in time, I'm going to go through every GH camera that LUMIX has ever made. We're going to start all the way back at the GH1 back in 2009. Believe it or not, 2009 was the GH1. And you can see we're going to talk about the GH2, the GH3, the GH4, GH5, the 5S, the 5 Mark II, which are some of the easy ones to forget about, the GH6, and now the GH7, which is where we're at in 2024. But before we talk about the cameras specifically, we need to talk about LUMIX. It was founded in 2001 by Panasonic. It launched LUMIX as its digital camera brand. Panasonic is a globally known brand, and even to this day, LUMIX itself is not really all that well known. I'd associate it with something like Coolpix from Nikon, where it just sounds maybe a little bit like cheaper, more off-brand, kind of like the consumer level. Hopefully that will continue to change, but if you talk to anyone outside the industry, I think LUMIX doesn't really resonate as much as the word Panasonic does. There was a Leica partnership from the very beginning, where it was kind of a collaboration to work on lenses, which is something unique to Panasonic, which they've done for quite a while. And the first models under the LUMIX brand were the DMC LC5 and the DMC LC40. These are kind of compact cameras. We're not talking about Micro Four Thirds, interchangeable lenses yet, just your kind of point and shoot typical type stuff. They did work with Olympus on the Micro Four Thirds system, which is based off of the 4/3 system, but micro meaning there's no mirror. It's smaller, more compact, there's no mirror, so it's fully electronic. And this was kind of launched Micro Four Thirds with the LUMIX G1. We're going to be talking a lot about the GH1, but the G1 was first in 2008 as the world's first mirrorless interchangeable lens camera. Obviously, LUMIX has been known for being a video pioneer. That's kind of the reputation that's been built up over time. As you'll see as we go through these cameras, it's kind of obvious in hindsight how they became so closely tied with video, especially with the GH1, even from the very beginning, but definitely with the GH4 and the GH5. This hybridization of photography and video into one, compact, feature-rich camera. So you didn't have to buy your photography camera and your video camera. It's a hybrid all in one. And they do have quite a few product lines. So we're going to talk about the GH lineup, but there's the G series, there's the GX, I think there was a GM for a while. There's a few different variants of these G cameras, and now they've even embraced full frame. So you have your S series of cameras, that's the LUMIX S line, that's full frame. But if it's a G camera, it's pretty much going to be a Micro Four Thirds camera. Let's start with the GH1. This was released in April 2009. That just saying it doesn't sound all that long ago, but that's quite a while ago now. And the original price was $1,500, and that's with a kit lens. I didn't realize this at the time. I ended up buying my GH1 off of eBay. I think it shipped from overseas. I think it came from Japan or somewhere. And I got it for around $600, just the body only. I opted for the gold model. That's one thing that the LUMIX cameras are kind of known for, having some different color variants as opposed to your typical just black camera. The GH1 had a gold version, and I got that specifically, as we'll talk about in a moment, to hack it. But the initial launch of the GH1, from my understanding, you had to get the kit lens, and it made it kind of expensive. If you think $1,500 sounds expensive in today's dollars, think back to 2009. That's quite expensive, all things considered. But it was pretty revolutionary. It's a 12 megapixel sensor, and it allows you to do full HD video recording, supporting 1080p and 720 at 60 frames a second. Now, in today's world, that's nothing incredible. But at this time, recording full HD video to an SD card was unheard of. This was not happening. It wasn't widespread. Yes, it was kind of at the start of the DSLR revolution. So you had cameras like the Canon 5D Mark II making waves. But up until this point, almost all video was done in the traditional broadcast camcorder style. You weren't getting this type of quality video from a photography camera, and you certainly weren't getting full HD. So just that alone at this price point was pretty revolutionary in terms of an alternative to the broadcast camcorder style, which were $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 easily at a minimum. One thing cool that they did back in the GH1 days and early on was this idea of a multi-aspect ratio sensor. So even though it's micro four thirds, and that's the standard size for the lenses, and it's kind of it's the mount, the aspect ratios on the sensor were all cropped from a slightly larger sensor. So meaning you weren't taking a 4x3 micro four thirds sensor and then cropping 16:9 from it. You were actually starting with a slightly larger sensor. And it's kind of hard to explain unless you really dive into the visuals, but it kind of allowed you more field of view when you came to all your different crops, whether it's 3x2, 16:9, 4x3. You have this kind of multi-aspect oversampled sensor in terms of where your crops are being pulled from. And one thing that's kind of been a staple of the LUMIX GH line is this articulating LCD screen. It really separated them, I think, even before people were really vlogging and content creating, and YouTube was still in its infancy back in 2009, right? This was early days of video on the internet and having access to this quality video. The LCD screen being fully articulating, meaning you can like rotate it around, was something very different than what Canon was offering. They did start doing that on, models like the 60D and a few others, but most photography cameras had a fixed screen on the back. So if you wanted to film yourself, that was quite a challenge. You had to rig up some kind of external monitor. And the LUMIX GH series has had the articulating screen from day one, which I think is actually quite impressive and a feature that has kind of carried its way all the way through the lineup, as you'll see. Obviously, with no mirror in there to reflect as in a SLR, a single lens relay, I'm forgetting the word, but a DSLR basically has a mirror in there that lets you see through the lens via a mirror. And when you take that out and you go for a mirrorless camera, you need a way to view that sensor, what the data is. You can use the LCD screen on the back, but a lot of people who are comfortable with photography prefer looking through a viewfinder, and that's where you get the EVF. So a digital way to view what the lens is seeing. Very common in your point and shoot type cameras, but this is kind of like replacing the DSLR with the electronic viewfinder and finding ways to work around what up until that point in time photographers are very comfortable like looking through a lens and seeing real life. Now you've got to compete with that because you don't have that opportunity with this type of camera. There was external microphone support on the GH1, kind of a little nod there to the video features. That's what the H kind of meant from the beginning, hybrid, meaning video, getting extra video features out of it. And obviously compact and lightweight design. This body style you see here is plastic. That will change as we get into future models. But just know from the very beginning, these were ultra compact, ultra lightweight. It looks kind of big and bulky by today's standards, and it still kind of is when you compare it to a smartphone or something like that. But at the time in 2009, this was like incredibly small, very impressive for what your alternatives might be in the photography space, or like I said, in the camcorder space. Now, the GH1 was decent enough on its own, but kind of expensive. Like I said, that having to buy it with the kit lens at $1,500, pretty expensive, especially in $2009. But one interesting thing that happened with the GH1 that made it special was that there was some testing going on in terms of firmware and hacking said firmware to get more out of the camera. This is back in the days of Magic Lantern when that was first kicking off in the Canon ecosystem, and hackers were playing around with what you could get out of the Canon cameras. And same thing was true on the LUMIX cameras. Let's open up that software architecture and let's see what's going on. Well, there was Tester 13, now I believe known as Vitali. He started a blog called Personal View, which still exists to this day. As far as I'm aware, I check it from time to time. But way back when, Tester 13 was hacking the GH1, and it became known as the GH13 if you hacked your camera. And that's why I bought the camera I did off of eBay, because that was one that was hackable. I believe they did patch the GH1 at some point in time to kind of prevent the firmware hacking, but then, as you know, hackers always like to find workarounds, and so I think there's always been that back and forth. But the GH1 was pretty impressive because you were able to increase the bit rate from your basic 17 megabits per second, which for video is not all that great. If you have motion or lots of detail, it just falls apart and turns to mud, like through compression. And you're actually able to get higher quality bit rates out of it, up to like 40 or 50. And this was a really fun time, kind of Wild West, downloading different patches, loading them into the camera. It's one of the best parts, I think, about the creative industries, is finding all these technical components as well and playing around with them. So when I bought my GH1 way back in 2009, 2010, this was a huge part of falling in love with the camera, was just testing out these patches, seeing which hacks work the best, and finding a stable patch that would get you a higher bit rate, as well as a more native way to record 24 frames a second. Because again, back in 2009, no one cared about 24 frames a second. It was like 30 frames a second. That's your TV broadcast standard. Why do you need 24? You're not going to make movies with this, are you? And of course, everyone wanted to make movies with their hybrid, DSLR Revolution style cameras. And so 24 frames per second was a highly sought after feature back in the day, and it was enabled with this hack. Now, moving on to the GH2. This came a little bit later, October 2010. So pretty quick follow-up if you're coming from like 2009 to 2010, like a year and a half life cycle. But what they were smart about with the GH2 is that they released it as a body-only option for just $899. So $900 would get you a GH2. And I think people at Panasonic were maybe freaking out, maybe embracing it. I don't really know, but loving that the GH1 had quite a fan base in terms of the hacker indie filmmaker community. So the GH2 was definitely a step up with a 16 megapixel sensor. It had better full HD video, so 1080p at 24 frames, which was actually built into the camera. You didn't have to hack it to get that, but you still were limited by that bit rate of maxing out around 23 megabits per second. So nothing too impressive there. And we got the touchscreen LCD on the GH2. And it still featured that multi-aspect sensor. So you're cropping from an oversized micro four thirds sensor, meaning you're not like losing as much as you are with some of the newer models that you will get to. And you're not really losing a lot. It's kind of a weird way to describe it. It's just kind of cool. You look it up, multi-aspect sensors, it's cool. And then we've got advanced video modes. So increasing the bit rate, we kind of already talked about that. Getting the manual exposure control, another thing that was not super common back then. In 2009, 2010, manual control of your exposure. You'd think it's like so obvious now, but back then there were a lot of cameras coming out from different brands, different manufacturers, where they would limit you to like auto exposure or auto white balance, or like you couldn't turn off your auto ISO. There's a lot of those types of problems in the early days where you just want a video camera and everyone's telling you, well, it's for photography and it has video features, but like LUMIX kind of got it early on, and I think they realized we should really beef up the video specs on this thing. Still had the compact design, lightweight body with similar build quality, still on the GH2 as plastic body, so lightweight and ultimately, decent all-arounder, just a step up from the GH1. And that firmware hack, yes, still worked on the GH2. After some further testing and configuration, they got those patches to work on the GH2, and people were able to get, increased bit rates of 100, 200 megabits per second. They might have even gotten to like 250, 300, I don't know. And talking about stable, usable, I think there's probably patches out there that could get you even higher than that if you really wanted to. But remember, we're back in 2010. We didn't have super fast SD cards like we do today. We certainly didn't have CF Express Type B or anything like that. The SD cards were slower. The amount you could record was limited by the physical media, as well as the camera being able to process that much data and how it was stored. But with people who were working on those patches, I think Nick Driftwood is a name that comes to mind. I think I'm getting that correct. I think the L Powell was a hacker tester type person. There's a lot of people involved in the community online, releasing patches, doing testing, digging in, and trying to optimize this so people could get the most out of these cameras, because they clearly were capable of it. And that's kind of the thing you'll see with these LUMIX hacks, as well as what Canon had, what people were discovering with Magic Lantern, is that the hardware was capable, but the companies, either through fear or for whatever reason, just were limiting them in their abilities. And so leave it up to users and some ingenuity to crack the code and make the most out of it. Now, I didn't buy a GH2 back in the day. I felt like these features were not a step up enough from my hacked GH1 that I appreciated what the GH2 offered. And when people ask me, hey, what camera should I buy? I always recommended the GH2 because it's a little bit better right out of the box, a little bit more bulletproof. You get those great features right from the beginning. But for me personally, I was really happy with the GH1, so I didn't see a need to upgrade to the GH2 given these features. Then we move on to the GH3, and this was released in November 2012 for $1,300. You can see the price kind of coming up a little bit there on the body-only model, and it's got a 16 megapixel sensor, and this is really where LUMIX, Panasonic double down on the video features on the hybrid model. I think they saw success with that a little bit on the GH1, thanks to some hackers in the online community. They saw that again with the GH2, this enthusiasm around video. And so I think Panasonic and LUMIX, I don't have any inside information, but I think what they said was, okay, let's really try and beef this thing up with the video specs, and let's kind of go all out. So it's got the weather sealed body. They changed from the plastic design to a magnesium alloy, and it's dust and splash resistant. That's something that's going to stick with this series, this lineup moving forward. So it becomes the new standard, magnesium alloy. We've got full HD video recording, 1080p up to 60 frames a second. So now not only are you doing 1080p, which is kind of the gold standard back in those days, you can also do slow motion 1080p, another kind of unique selling point proposition. Now, this is where you start getting into the arguments and people arguing over sensor size, because Micro Four Thirds is smaller than APS-C. It is smaller than full frame. So it became the kind of thing back in the day. We're arguing over like, what's the crop and how does this lens look and what's your crop factor? Oh, it's a 2x crop. But when you look at the features of the camera, regardless of the crop and what the sensor is, the sensor was bigger than anything that had come before it in terms of camcorders, right? What we were dealing with like 1/3-inch chips and just tiny camcorder sensors. Anything in the interchangeable lens space was going to be bigger than that. It just was, did you want that full frame look or did you want Micro Four Thirds? And there's benefits to both. The GH3 also included Wi-Fi connectivity, so you can kind of pair it with a smartphone, remote control, easy image transfer. This is something that almost every manufacturer has kept since then, but LUMIX certainly introduced it on the GH3, and I've never really gotten them. Like, I've used it from time to time, but it's one of those things that you wish it always worked a little bit better than it actually does. And we get an OLED touchscreen and EVF, as well as some better video features, meaning higher bit rates all the way up to 72 megabits per second. So now we're looking at something pretty decent, pretty reasonable without having to hack it. And I think that's what they were looking to offer. What's the camera that we can sell right off the shelf that you, as the customer, don't have to worry about downloading firmware patches and hacking your camera open? I don't think most companies want people doing that. And so rightfully so, they built it right in from the beginning, a decent bit rate for the base firmware, as well as timecode support for more professional workflows. And we got some longer battery life with the GH3, which is always good, and that's what we want to see. But the GH3 really wasn't that impressive, I think, from everyone who had the GH2. If I go back here, when you look at the GH2 compared to the GH3, everyone who hacked the GH2 kind of looked at the GH3 going like, I already have that because I did the work with these patches that I was downloading. Now, granted, if you hadn't messed with the GH2 and you hadn't cracked it open, you probably would have gone for the GH3, but I don't think it made a big enough splash. It didn't cause enough waves to really get the attention that it maybe deserved. But the GH2 was just so popular, and people had kind of the same problem I had with the GH1 to the GH2. It's like, I already got a great camera that does all these things. You're not really offering me that much more. So why would I upgrade? And I think the GH3 got kind of stuck in that malaise, in the kind of like humdrum. At this point, there was a lot of cameras coming out that all had video features, and everyone was kind of arguing, like I said, over sensor size. And I think it kind of just got lost in the shuffle. On paper, these features are really nice, but it was kind of patching up, for lack of a better word, all the patches that had kind of exploited the firmware hack up until that point. So the GH3 kind of went under the radar, I think, for a lot of people. I'm sure there's people out there who love it and maybe still have it to this day. But from a pop culture zeitgeist standpoint, it didn't really make as many waves as the GH2. But that is all about to change with the GH4, because the GH4 was released May 2014. I bought it pretty much day one, I think, for $1699. So $1,700, body only. More expensive. That's a pattern you're going to recognize as we go through this. But what's the big feature? 4K video recording is the first interchangeable mirrorless camera with internal 4K recording at both DCI 4K and UHD 4K. That was a game changer, for lack of a better word. Everyone says game changer, revolutionary, but it was. 4K internal for $1,700 was crazy. And I bought one of these like day one. Coming from a GH1, which I loved, I would say, okay, I'm a fan of LUMIX. I got the lenses. I like this mirrorless mount. I can adapt all my old Nikon glass, and I don't have to worry about a mirror box. I don't have to deal with Canon's limitations on their mushy 1080p video. I get 4K video for $1,700. This camera didn't have to do anything more than that. I still would have been happy. All to an SD card, which at this point, we're getting a little bit faster. We're getting better, and certainly way cheaper than the media of old, which if you're familiar with some of my other videos, and even back before LUMIX and all that, you know, Panasonic had P2 memory cards. You were paying $800 for 4 gigabytes. It was kind of ridiculous. This was that kind of perfect storm of a camera where it just had everything you wanted at the perfect price point, and you could finally do what I would say is like high quality video production on a hybrid camera. It's got a 16 megapixel sensor, weather sealed body, magnesium alloy, and you get higher bit rates, up to 200 megabits per second. So we're done looking at 72 megabits. We're done looking at the silly days of the GH1 with only 17 megabits. We're looking at 200 megabits per second. It's got anamorphic support, so you could shoot open gate before it was even called open gate. And it had Vlog L via a firmware update. You had to pay for that. I believe it was $100. And timecode synchronization. So you can see they really put their video first as part of this hybrid mentality. There were more photography features. I should mention that this is not comprehensive in terms of everything that was added. I'm specifically focused on just the video features because that's kind of where I think it's most interesting. But there were some other photography advancements. All these cameras say the autofocus is better and it's got better burst rates and all this other stuff for photo. But for video, this is what matters to me. And the GH4 was where we first saw this idea of adding like kind of expansion hardware to the camera. So they announced this DMW YAGH, the YAG unit. It's an accessory that kind of went under the GH4. I didn't get one. I thought it looked kind of silly, kind of stupid. It's this big bulky box that goes on the bottom of the GH4 that lets you plug in XLRs. And I think it gives you HDMI out or something, because on the GH4, it was micro HDMI. I think that YAG has a full-size HDMI, but it was kind of clunky. It needed its own power supply, and it was expensive, big and bulky. But it was this idea of, what if we took the camera and we added more to it via these like paid expansion accessory type units? It almost reminds me back to the day of the Sega Genesis, where people, you were building out these crazy video game consoles by adding more expansion units onto it to try and get the most out of it. And that's where this is where that kind of mentality started for LUMIX, and we're going to see some more of that coming in future cameras here. But the GH4 is where it started. And this really was, for me, that like a light bulb moment of a camera that can do so much for such a little price in a form factor that fits right in the palm of your hand. You can take photo, which with the rise of YouTube going through all these years, we're in 2014 now, You need thumbnails, you need custom photo. You have clients who are asking you to take pictures for social media at the same time you're trying to record high quality video and doing your corporate interviews and doing all this stuff. And the GH4 really did all of that. The only downside for me on the GH4 was it was still using like an old file architecture. I believe FAT32, you can only have file sizes up to 4 gigabytes. And at 4K with the bit rates that we talked about, 4 gigabyte files equates to roughly 4 minutes of footage. And so if you wanted to record continuous on the GH4, you could record continuous, but when you looked at your files, they'd all be split up into 4 gigabyte clips, basically 4-minute clips. So if you had a 40-minute interview, you'd have 10 clips. And you guys work around that in post-production in your editing software, whatever you're using, but it was really annoying to have 10 clips of basically the same thing where you're recording continuous. And I just remember back during that time, it being one of those unfortunate limitations, restrictions, things you have to deal with to be a hybrid shooter, where anyone shooting, broadcast camcorders, like, we just have, long clips and it's all kind of, not always, but in general, they're built as video cameras. And that's where someone would still say, well, like, if you need video, get a real video camera. It's like, yeah, but I can't get 4K for $1,700 like anywhere else. This is truly a game changer. But then we get to probably like the unicorn of the LUMIX lineup, which is the GH5. You probably already know it. You probably love it. Everyone does. The GH5 was just so perfect. So it takes the GH4 lessons and we get to the GH5. It's released in March of 2017. So 3 years later, we get the GH5 for, again, price increase, $2,000 body only. Kind of expensive, but we get a better, more resolution sensor, 20 megapixels, and we can get that internal 4K, but now we're getting 10-bit 422. Basically like unmatched, unheard of at the time when everyone was dealing with 8-bit footage and everyone on the internet and YouTube is trying to find the workarounds of how do I get this 8-bit footage to even look good. It looks like garbage. And we get 10-bit 422 video with unlimited recording time in 4K and up to 60 frames a second. So not only do we get 4K 24, but we get 4K 60, which is huge. Like slow motion 4K, like this blew my mind. And we shifted from that FAT32 architecture to where now if you recorded continuous, it was just one clip. So there was no more 4 gigabyte, 4-minute limitation where stuff was split up and you had to work around it. If you recorded for an hour, you had a clip that was an hour and it was glorious. You also, let alone, that would be enough. But they also added IBIS, the in-body image stabilization, 5-axis. So this is it's common now. It's obvious. Almost every camera system has it. But again, at the time, back in 2017, this was kind of a game changer, kind of unheard of. Everyone was rigging out gimbals and stabilization systems, trying to make their DIY steady cams at home, trying to, I'm going to set up the slider because that's going to help me get movement but still be stable. And here LUMIX comes and says, don't worry about it. We got you with our IBIS, our in-body image stabilization. And to this day, I think most people admit the LUMIX cameras have some of the best, if not the best, image stabilization built right in. So it doesn't matter if your lens has stabilization on it or not, because that was the kind of the thing you had to, back in the day, you'd look for stabilized lenses that were more expensive. No, the GH5 says, I don't care what lens it is, I'm going to stabilize it for you. And it worked incredibly well. And then not to mention that we get better color, we get 4K 60, and we get dual SD card slots. So, a lot of times people are afraid, what if my card gets corrupted? What if I lose it? What if something bad happens? Well, now you've got 2 SD card slots. You can record your backups. You can have redundancy. That's truly a professional way to record. And on top of that, we get Vlog L as an optional upgrade, again, paid. We have our great anamorphic mode known as OpenGate now, but back then we we're still calling it anamorphic. We get higher bit rates up to 400 megabits per second and HDR support. It just keeps getting better and better. And we have full-size HDMI. Come on. This is the perfect camera for almost anybody. If you want to argue about autofocus, which we'll get to, and if you want to argue about sensor size, yes, fair enough. If you want full frame, go for it. But when it comes to features, price point, everything, This was the golden ticket, the unicorn, like I said, the LUMIX GH5, and it sold like hotcakes. I think this brought people into the industry because they for the first time, this level of production was affordable and within reach. And you had people switching to LUMIX and buying multiples of these, going, all in and basically taking their whole system to LUMIX GH5s. And there's still people to this day shooting with GH5s because they're that good. So you take something good, let's make it better. Well, that's kind of arguable. LUMIX comes out with the GH5S. And this is actually something they haven't done in a while. It's kind of a one-off, but I really like it in theory. This was released January 2018 for $2,500. Again, price increase. And what are we looking at? What is a GH5S? What does the S mean? Well, it's a reduced resolution sensor. So it's only 10 megapixels. And it's a lower resolution designed specifically for superior low light performance and dynamic range. Because up until this point in time, Sony with the A7S, are you seeing a pattern here? The A7S was crowned the king of low light. And being full frame, being low megapixel, the A7S was taking a lot of attention. It was like 1080p, you didn't get 4K, well, maybe on the A7S II you did. I'm forgetting now, I'd have to go look that up. But basically the A7S, the first one was 1080p. They finally added 4K. I'm getting off on a tangent. The S, that speed, the low light performance was knocking people's socks off. And they're like, I can film in the dark. Well, how important is that? How often are you filming in the dark? Lighting is a part of your image. So like you shouldn't film necessarily in the dark, but like, yeah, you can if you want to. Well, LUMIX said, let's embrace that same mentality. Let's lower the megapixel count and focus on low light performance. So we have something like that. We have the GH5 that's selling like hotcakes. What if we had a low light version to go along with that? Great in theory. So let's see how it panned out. It's got dual native ISO, meaning the sensor is using both ISO values of like 400 and 2500, meaning you can, like your lower ISO will be clean, and then when you switch that higher ISO, it'll also be clean because it has two different circuits. I'm not an electrical engineer. I don't know exactly how it works, but it does give you cleaner low light images and video. So this dual native ISO, meaning you just get higher ISOs that are cleaner compared to the base GH5. And you get Vlog-L pre-installed. Now, we are still talking about Vlog-L, keep that in mind, but you didn't have to pay for it as a firmware upgrade. There was no extra cost. It just came installed right in the camera. And we get back this multi-aspect sensor because that had kind of been lost on, I believe, the GH3 or the GH4. They kind of did away with this multi-aspect sensor and it just said, it's a 4x3 sensor and you're going to take your crops from that. But with the GH5S being this like specialty reduced resolution sensor, we will go back to this multi-aspect, which is kind of cool. But what's the Achilles heel? There's no IBIS. The game-changing, one of the biggest features on the GH5 that made the GH5 so great, the 5-axis stabilization gets removed. I guess it doesn't work with this sensor, the dual ISO. I don't know why, but it's just not an option on the 5S. And the pitch at the time was, well, it's okay, you can use your Ronin, your gimbal, your stabilizer, whatever, you don't need the IBIS. But I think for me and for a lot of people, that IBIS was so helpful and so useful in a world plagued, because back in these days, and even before this, DSLR video was known as being like super shaky, super jittery. People, one, weren't getting their shutter speeds right because they were just using all sorts of random shutter speeds. They weren't following the 180-degree shutter angle rule. So their shutter speed was off, and then you'd also have the rolling shutter of the sensor itself, causing a lot of jello and jiggle and shake. And the fact that these cameras are so small makes them very easy to manipulate. So if you have a more shaky hand, a more shaky grip, a lot of that was kind of seen in these like micro jitters. So you have a bunch of different factors contributing to this problem of shaky footage. You solve it with the IBIS, but then on the GH5S, we take the IBIS away. So there's definitely people who prefer the GH5S. They prefer the dynamic range, the low light. They think it's better, it's cleaner. But there's also a lot of people who weren't willing to sacrifice losing that IBIS just for the sake of low light. So it's kind of like pick your poison. It was hard to decide which one was better. And ultimately, the GH5S being more expensive also, I think, made it less popular overall. But GH5 still selling like hotcakes, super popular. Let's make a GH5 Mark II. We see these other companies making Mark II versions of their cameras. What if the GH5 had a Mark II? What would that look like? So this was released in June 2021 for $1,700 body only, which is actually cheaper than the GH5 because this is now well into its life cycle. What do we say? If we go all the way back to the GH5, that was 2017. Flash forward now to 2021, and it's like, can we ask people to pay $2,000 again for kind of the same camera? No, we can't. So we're going to reduce the price by $300. And we're going to give them a 20 megapixel sensor. We're going to give them internal 10-bit 420 4K 60. And we're going to give them live streaming. 2021, I mean, at this point, YouTube streaming, it's all very popular. What if you could go right from the camera, right to the cloud, and have live streaming done that way? You don't need a computer. You don't need anything like that. And it was built in. And it works, but also in my experience, it doesn't work. A little spotty, which is kind of what I'd have to say for any like wireless video solution, especially when it comes to the apps and the smartphones. They all work in theory, and when they do work, it is pretty magical. But when they don't work, it's so frustrating because you realize it's not a feature you can rely on. So I do have a GH5 Mark II. I have tested this, and it can work, but it's a lot of troubleshooting and it's a lot of problem solving, which if you're doing production, that's not what you want to be dealing with. The GH5 Mark II took a cue from the GH5S and had Vlog L pre-installed. Another nice little feature, you don't have to pay for it. And we get the IBIS back, and it's supposedly improved on the GH5 Mark II, but I don't know by how much. I can't really validate and say it's better than the GH5, but they do say it's increased, it's improved, just like the autofocus, just like everything there. It's like, it's improved, whatever that means. And we get this enhanced battery life. So the GH5 Mark II is when they started working with the new DMW BLK22 batteries, still in use by most of the LUMIX cameras of this caliber, and even on the S line. Those BLK22s are fairly standard on LUMIX cameras. I can't say they're universal standard for LUMIX. I don't think that's actually true, but they are very common nowadays and very well embraced. And the GH5 Mark II, you could use the GH5 batteries, you could use the old batteries as well as the new ones. So that's kind of a nice little bridge to help people move to the new battery system that did give you a little bit better performance. But ultimately, the GH5 Mark II was kind of plagued by the fact that it's just a carbon copy of something that already exists with a few extra bells and whistles that I don't think anyone really like asked for or needed. At this point in time, 2021, people were talking about autofocus. Sony was killing it with just incredible eye tracking and good autofocus in video, and LUMIX for the longest time, the Achilles heel has always been the sensor size and autofocus in video. And they still didn't seal that deal for the GH5 Mark II. So I think people kind of skipped it and said, well, I have a GH5 Mark I, why would I get the Mark II? So then we move to the GH6. Another interesting step up. This was released February 2022 for, again, price increase, $2,200 body only. A 25 megapixel sensor with 5.7K video recording. So we're getting more resolution from the sensor. We're getting even more resolution in our video modes, basically 6K. And we're getting unlimited recording with this kind of heat management system, which enables extended recording times. During this time, after 2020 and into 2021 and 2022, heat management, thermal management has become like the talking point in the zeitgeist. And I put a picture of the GH6, the back of it, intentionally because you can see that extra built out fan, those ports there on the back next to the screen, as well as the card slots, which we're going to get to. But basically selling, we've got a fan built in. This thing will not overheat. Don't worry about it. We're not Canon. We're not Sony. We take thermal management seriously. And so we got you the biggest, beefiest fan you've ever seen. And it is. It makes the camera bigger and bulkier. It doesn't really cause a lot of noise, not that I've known. Maybe if you're in ultra quiet environments, you might hear it. But for me, I've never had an issue with the noise. I just kind of like the peace of mind of knowing, hey, well, it's got a fan there. It shouldn't overheat. And we get 4K 120 as well as full HD up to 300 frames per second. So even more slow-mo options for you slow-mo fiends out there. We also get internal Apple ProRes, which is kind of a little like too late to the game. Back in the day, in the early days, certainly, these compressed MP4 H.264 files were really frustrating to edit. The computers couldn't keep up with the compression. It would bog down your machine. A lot of people were transcoding their native H.264 files to ProRes and editing ProRes files. Well, finally, LUMIX decides in 2022, we're going to put internal ProRes on our camera. But at this point in time, most computers, most software, most editing suites can handle the H.264 stuff. They can handle H.265. They can handle 8-bit and 10-bit files. They don't need ProRes like they did maybe 10 years ago before this camera. So it is nice to have for the professionals who want to use it, but ProRes files are bigger, meaning they take up more file space, meaning your hard drive costs increase, and it just makes production more expensive. Although ProRes is a beautiful codec, and I do really enjoy when I get to use it, but it's not for everything. If you're recording hours and hours and hours of footage, it can really eat up your hard drive space. So it's there if you want it. Kind of cool to have it internal. But again, maybe too little too late. We also get improvements to the IBIS, saying up to 7.5 stops with dual IS2. So if you're using a stabilized lens in conjunction with the IBIS, you get even better performance on the GH6. And I would say in my case, that is true. I have seen the GH6 perform better than a GH5, and I do really like the IBIS on it. We also get dynamic range boost, which combines the dual gain output for up to 13 plus stops of dynamic range. Now, the caveat being here that this only works at the higher ISOs on the GH6, which is an unfortunate limitation. So even though you can get more dynamic range, it comes at the sacrifice of having more noise in the image. So me personally, I ended up not using it as much as I thought I would on the GH6 just because those higher ISOs were not as clean as I wanted them to be. You get more of that like mosquito noise that people always talk about, and the extra stop of dynamic range just wasn't really worth it for me as a trade-off. But we do get CF Express Type B slot as well as an SD card slot, so dual slots. One's even faster with CF Express Type B, and I really like those cards. I find them very affordable. You can get huge CF Express Type B cards for pretty decent prices, very fast performance, and it's just a great way to shoot. You start recording, you stop recording, it's very responsive, where SD cards are a little bit like slower, I feel like. And we've taken the articulating LCD screen and we've expanded it to a tilt and rotate LCD screen. So where you can see that fan on the image, that screen actually flips up and it tilts out. So we get more articulation out of this thing with a very unique tilt and kind of free angle design, which is very cool. And I really like that the screen can just flip up when you're looking straight down at it. It's very nice if it's on a tripod or if it's handheld and you're just looking straight down, or it can still flip to the side and flip around if you want to film yourself. We also get, the list is never ending on the GH6, audio support for 4-channel XLR recording with the optional XLR1 adapter. I believe that did work on the GH5, but I don't think it worked in 4-channel audio. So like you'd have to use XLR, or you'd have to take it off and just record with your standard mic jack. I don't think the GH5 had 4 channels of audio. We really got that with the GH6, and with that XLR1 adapter, getting 4 channels of audio means you can mic up to theoretically 4 subjects all in one camera, and I like those types of solutions. I don't like the external audio recorder in addition to the camera because it's just more stuff you have to bring, more stuff you have to sync up in post, and the more you can streamline and simplify, you can save money first and foremost, but you can also make your life easier and better and your production more streamlined. So I love this feature. I've used it a lot actually on the GH6. 4 channels of audio, 4 different microphones if I need it. It's quite a compelling feature, and I did buy that XLR1 adapter to do that. And we get USB-C power delivery. Another huge advantage to the GH6, you can basically power it indefinitely, just forever, if you have some kind of USB-C power delivery input. So you can plug into the wall, and this is a really safe way. Instead of using a dummy battery, like kind of the old model of powering these cameras, you put a dummy battery in. If that ever loses power, the camera itself doesn't have a power backup. So you have a critical power failure, meaning your card and the clip that it was recording could get corrupted. With the USB-C power, if that gets unplugged, there's still the battery in the camera that's charging as well, and that can just keep things rolling for you. So it's a really nice way, again, peace of mind, just to be able to record indefinitely if you need to. And No, this isn't an and, this is a but. But we have still, to this day on the GH6, in 2022, we still have depth from defocus, the DFD, the bane of the LUMIX cameras, this contrast-based autofocus in video, just terrible. For as much as they say it's improved and it's better, and here's the workarounds, and use these settings, and you'll get the, no. Even on the LUMIX GH6, the autofocus is nowhere near reliable in video mode. If you need autofocus, people are still going with Sony. And again, you know, full frame, that's a whole another thing you can get into. But people just wanted good autofocuses at this point in time. And when the GH6 didn't deliver, everyone was hoping, expecting, anticipating that we would get phase detect autofocus on the GH6, and they did not hit the mark. And I got this little asterisk on here that's been up here the whole time. There's this insignificant streaking issue with the GH6 that ended up being kind of its doom, I think. There's clips you can find online of, in certain parts of the highlights, in certain modes at higher ISOs, you'll get some streaking across the sensor. And this is something that never got fixed via firmware, it never got patched. It just is how the sensor performs on the GH6. In certain conditions, you get a streak. It is most noticeable with the log footage. So once you color grade it, it kind of goes away for the most part. It's only in really fringe, extreme scenarios at those super high ISOs where sometimes this can be a problem. But honestly, the entire time I've shot with the GH6, I've seen it like one time. And the moment I put the color correction, the LUT on there, it went away. So I think it was kind of overblown. Maybe some people had a legitimate issue with it, but for me, it never caused me any problems. Certainly not anything that I would, freak out about. But I do think it really turned a lot of people off to the GH6, even though this is the longest list of features that I've shown up until this point, all the way going back from the GH1 through the GH4 through the GH5. The GH6 is the most stacked camera in terms of features and performance, and price is still reasonable. But the fact that it didn't have autofocus, good autofocus in video, and it had this streaking issue that was, I think, kind of blown out of proportion, really turned a lot of people off to it, and they just stuck to their GH5s, because why change? If the GH5 is so great, why would I get a GH6? Even though it has so many advantages. And I bought a GH6. I bought two of them, actually, because I do think they're quite great. I bought them right from the beginning before I even knew about the streaking issue. And I think it's kind of a saving grace in hindsight that I didn't see that. If I had seen people talking about that, I probably wouldn't have bought a GH6. I'd been more worried, but I didn't really know about it at the time. So I just bought it kind of blindly, which is maybe not a great thing, but I think in this circumstance, it actually worked out to my benefit, because I never encountered it. And it was only later, like 6 months in shooting with it, someone asked, like, have you ever seen the streaking issue? And I said, I don't even know what you're talking about. So I do think the GH6 is probably the most underrated of the LUMIX lineup, because it is so powerful, but it's just not a lot of people bought them, and it just kind of fell flat in the midst of everyone caring, the industry caring about autofocus. So that brings us to today with the GH7. The GH7 was released July 2024 for, hey, look at that. The price didn't go up, $2,200, body only. That's kind of nice. With a 25 megapixel sensor. And finally, after a decade or more of people complaining about autofocus on the LUMIX cameras, we finally get phase detect autofocus on a micro four thirds camera that actually delivers the video features people want. Technically, phase detect came to micro four thirds earlier with the G9 Mark II, but the GH7, the GH line, finally got phase detect with the GH7, and it's glorious. It's amazing. I can't say it's perfect. I'm sure Sony has had longer to refine their autofocus system. Canon autofocus, from what I hear, works well. Nikon autofocus works well. But I think for the LUMIX fans, the LUMIX enthusiasts who've been waiting for so long, I'm glad they finally delivered and they didn't leave us hanging. We finally got phase detect autofocus on a micro four thirds camera that can shoot incredible video, and it works great. It's spectacular. You got face detect, human detect. You can detect airplanes and trains and cars and animals. It's pretty cool, and it works really, really well. We also get dynamic range boost that works at all the ISOs. So as opposed to the GH6, where we had to use those higher ISOs, they were noisier for that boost. Now in the GH7, the dynamic range boost just works all the time, which is great. You don't have to think about it. And we get external SSD recording. Now, technically, this came to the GH6 as a firmware update, but it was included right from the beginning on the GH7, which is nice. You can use the SSDs if you prefer. I don't really like to use that method because I use the USB port for powering the camera, but if you don't do that, you can record to an SSD if you prefer. And we get slow-mo, 4K, 10-bit, 420, up to 120 frames per second. That's very nice. And we get 32-bit float audio if you use the XLR2 adapter. And unfortunately, that's a $500 additional charge. So this is one of those features that's like, yes, the camera can do it, but you have to pay more. So instead of a $2,200 camera, now you're paying $2,700. And you can also pay more for the ARRI Log C3 gamma profile if you want to match ARRI Alexa footage. It's an extra $200. So you can be looking at maybe like a $3,000 camera, all things considered, to get the most out of it, but it can do it, which is nice. And that's where we're at. The GH7. I have one. I found one used on sale at a great discount, so I scooped it up immediately when I saw it. I think it was like 50% off or something crazy like that. And it really is. It's what the GH6 should have been. So if you are into Micro Four Thirds and you like this hybrid style of shooting, photography, cinematography, whatever it might be, having the one camera that can do it all. If you have a lot of Micro Four Thirds lenses, which there are some fabulous Micro Four Thirds lenses, the 10 to 25, the 25 to 50, the 50 to 200, these are great, beautiful lenses that are fast, that are sharp, that are, some of the best lenses I've ever used in terms of run and gun, just having focal lengths that make sense, that work for what you want to do. I think Micro Four Thirds is a beautiful platform that keeps things small, compact, lightweight, still fast. You still get the shallow depth of field when you want it and when you need it, but you're not bogged down by the size and the expense and the weight of full frame. You get that extra telephoto reach with Micro Four Thirds. There's a lot of reasons to be enthusiastic about Micro Four Thirds to this day. And I think the GH7 really kind of hit the nail on the head with everything that it offers. You get so much out of this camera. It's what the GH line has been building up to for, over the longer than a decade now. And we finally get what I think everyone had been waiting for, which is that reliable autofocus in video, which is unfortunate that it took so long to get here. I think the GH6 would have sold way more, way better if they had just bit the bullet. I don't know what took them so long, why they delayed, but Panasonic, LUMIX, for whatever reason, took so long, losing so many sales, losing so much ground to Sony, just because of autofocus and full frame. But that's a whole nother series if we talk about the S cameras. But for Micro Four Thirds and the GH cameras, the GH7, I don't think it gets any better. There's no streaking issue or like anything like that like we had on the GH6. It is the perfect Micro Four Thirds camera, unless you want something, super small, even smaller, more pocketable. But with these kinds of lenses, nothing's going in your pocket. So let's be real. You can hold it in your hand. You can shoot all day. It's lightweight. It's run and gun. It can do everything you need and more. And I'm just so happy and blessed to have found such a great camera system from day one. I track it all the way back to the GH1, and that hacking mentality of how do I get something affordable and make it better and get the most out of it. I love that mentality, and I feel like that's what these LUMIX GH cameras have been for me, a way to make money, not spending tens of thousands of dollars, just to have a Red, just to have an ARRI, just to have the latest and greatest, most expensive thing from Canon that doesn't even do what I need it to do because it can't shoot 4K or because it can't, the LUMIX cameras have always held up for everything I've put them through. And now finally we have almost every of those, basically every box has been checked. If you want full frame, LUMIX has that with the S lineup. But for Micro Four Thirds, the LUMIX GH7 checks every single box and more.